The midnight fog was so thick that the headlights of Mark's old sedan barely cut through it, casting eerie shadows that flickered over the quiet, empty road. He adjusted his grip on the wheel, trying to shake the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. The night was dead silent, save for the steady hum of the engine and the faint whisper of wind rustling the trees on either side. Mark had been driving back from a friend's house, a 2-hour drive through the desolate back roads, but he'd done it countless times. Tonight, though, the road felt different. The fog was unnatural, blanketing everything like a suffocating shroud, and the GPS, it kept rerouting him as if it didn't want him to leave. He rubbed his eyes and tried to convince himself it was just the long day catching up with him. Then he saw something on the side of the road, a dark figure standing motionless, barely visible in the mist. He felt his heart skip. He slowed down, squinting to make out any details. It looked like a woman, draped in black, her face obscured by a dark hood. "Hey, do you need help?" he called out, rolling down the window just a crack, keeping one hand ready on the gear shift, just in case. But the figure didn't move. She simply stood there, her head slowly tilting to one side, as if observing him. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. "Okay, maybe not," he muttered, easing his foot back on the gas pedal. Just as he started moving, he glanced in the rearview mirror and his stomach dropped. The woman was gone. He hadn't seen her move, hadn't even blinked, but she wasn't there anymore. He scanned the road, his pulse pounding, trying to rationalize it. Mark took a deep breath, chalking it up to his imagination. But just as he turned his eyes back to the road, there she was, standing right in the middle of his lane, directly ahead. He slammed on the brakes, the car screeching as he struggled to keep control. "Jesus!" he yelled, heart racing. She was staring straight at him, though he couldn't see her face clearly through the hood. Only the faintest glimmer of her eyes caught the light, unnaturally reflective, like an animal's. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" he yelled, frustration overriding his fear for a moment. But again, she made no response, her gaze fixed and unblinking. A sick, cold dread settled in his stomach as he realized she wasn't moving out of the way. Gritting his teeth, he tried to maneuver around her, keeping a safe distance. As he passed, he stole a quick look out the passenger window. She turned her head to follow his movement, her eyes never leaving him. Once he was past, Mark accelerated, his hands trembling. He didn't look back. He just wanted to get home, lock the doors, and forget this ever happened. But after a few minutes, his headlights illuminated a figure up ahead, standing at the edge of the road. He barely had time to register that it was her, again, somehow impossibly ahead of him. "What the?" he whispered, feeling his stomach twist. She was closer this time, almost reaching out toward him as he passed. He kept his gaze locked on the road, gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He didn't dare look at her, but he could feel her watching him, that icy stare penetrating through the metal and glass, chilling him to the bone. For the next 10 miles, she appeared again and again, each time closer to the road, each time seeming a little more real, her presence darker, more menacing. And then he heard it, a soft, rasping whisper coming from the empty seat beside him. "Help me." Mark's blood ran cold. His mind raced, rationalizing, denying, but the voice came again, this time clearer, more insistent. "Help me." He felt the hairs on his arms rise, and his stomach lurched as he dared a quick glance to his right. The seat was empty, but his mind filled with an overwhelming feeling of something. Sadness? Fear? He couldn't tell. He felt her desperation, her suffering, as if it were his own. And then there was a quiet whisper, as close as if it were right in his ear. "Look behind you." Mark squeezed his eyes shut for a split second, fighting the urge to turn around. He'd seen enough horror movies to know how that would end. But curiosity got the better of him. He looked in the rearview mirror, and there she was, sitting in the back seat, her face still hidden, her hollow eyes staring directly into his. Mark's scream was involuntary, but he forced himself to keep his hands steady on the wheel. He pressed harder on the gas, the engine roaring as the car sped down the empty road. The fog thickened, swallowing the road, like making it feel like he was the only person left in the world. He didn't dare look back again. He just kept driving, hoping that at some point he'd escape whatever this was. But then something strange happened. The fog began to clear, just slightly. He could make out the faint outline of a house up ahead, a rickety old structure with a flickering light in the window. The woman's voice whispered once more, almost pleading now. Please, help me, home. Mark's instincts screamed to keep going, to drive past the house and never look back, but something made him stop. Against every ounce of his better judgment, he pulled over. He sat there, engine idling, heart pounding, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, slowly, the back seat creaked, as if someone was getting out. He felt the shift in weight, heard the soft click of the door opening and closing, and then silence. She was gone. Mark looked at the house, half expecting to see her in one of the windows, but there was no sign of her, just the dim light casting long shadows across the yard. With a shudder, he put the car in gear and drove away. It wasn't until he got home that he noticed the photo on his dashboard. It hadn't been there before. It was old, black and white, the edges frayed. In it, he saw the woman he'd encountered, her face finally clear. Her eyes held that same pleading look, the look of someone desperate for freedom. Scrawled across the bottom were 3 words that made his blood run cold. Help me rest. Mark shivered, tucking the photo into his pocket. From that night on, he could never shake the feeling of being watched, a cold presence lingering wherever he went. And every so often, just as he drifted to sleep, he'd hear that same faint whisper, always the same words. Help me. Rest. Emily had always been fascinated by old houses. As an aspiring photographer, she sought out abandoned places, capturing their forgotten beauty through her lens. So when she heard about the Holloway house on the outskirts of town, rumored to be haunted, she knew she had to explore it. The house stood silent and imposing, its Victorian architecture cloaked in ivy and shadow. Windows were shattered, and the once grand porch sagged under years of neglect. The locals avoided it, especially after dusk, whispering tales of disappearances and eerie lights seen through the broken panes. But Emily was undeterred. She believed the stories were just that, stories. Perfect subjects for her portfolio. She arrived just as the sun began to set, the sky painted with hues of orange and purple. Armed with her camera, a flashlight, and a backpack filled with essentials, Emily pushed open the creaking gate. The ironwork was intricate, but corroded, vines intertwining with the metal in a tangled embrace. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the property, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. The front door hung ajar, inviting her in. She hesitated for a moment, the air thick with anticipation. With a steadying breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dim, the only light filtering through the broken windows. Dust particles danced in the beams of her flashlight as she moved through the grand foyer, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. Emily began her exploration, moving from room to room, each space telling a story of its own. Portraits adorned the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to follow her every move. Furniture lay scattered, covered in white sheets that gave the rooms an ethereal quality. She snapped photos, her camera capturing the haunting beauty of decay. As she ventured upstairs, the temperature seemed to drop. Her breath became visible, misting in the cold air. The hallway was narrow, lined with doors that led to bedrooms and studies. One door, slightly ajar, caught her attention. She approached cautiously, pushing it open to reveal a small nursery. The room was preserved better than the rest, toys neatly arranged in a crib in the corner. On the wall hung a mobile, swaying gently despite the lack of wind. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She set up her camera, focusing on the mobile. As she adjusted the lens, she heard a soft lullaby, barely audible over the creaks and groans of the house. Her heart raced, but curiosity propelled her forward. She turned to see a small figure standing by the window, a girl, no older than 6, with pale skin and dark, hollow eyes. "Hello," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The girl didn't respond. Instead, she began to move toward Emily, her steps silent. Emily raised her camera, trying to capture the apparition. The flash illuminated the room, and for a split second, the girl froze, her eyes meeting Emily's. A wave of fear washed over her, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl tilted her head, and Emily could see the sadness etched into her features. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness as the flashlight flickered and died. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She fumbled with the flashlight, trying to turn it back on, but it remained dead. In the pitch black, she felt a presence, a cold breath against her neck. "Leave now," a voice echoed, faint and distant, yet unmistakably clear. Emily spun around, her back pressed against the wall. Panic surged through her as she realized she was not alone. The temperature dropped further, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She fumbled to turn on her phone's flashlight, the weak beam cutting through the darkness. She saw the girl again, standing at the foot of the bed, her eyes pleading. "Why are you here?" Emily demanded, her voice cracking. The girl raised a hand, pointing toward the window. Emily followed her gaze, seeing the reflection of a figure standing outside, a man, tall and menacing, his face obscured by shadows. The man began to move closer, his presence oppressive. Emily backed away, stumbling over a fallen toy. "Please, help me," the girl whispered, her voice breaking. Emily's mind raced. She remembered the local legends, how the house belonged to the Holloways, a family that vanished without a trace decades ago. Some said they were victims of a curse, others believed darker forces were at play. Now, standing in the nursery, she felt the weight of those stories pressing down on her. Summoning her courage, Emily approached the girl. "What do you want?" she asked softly. The girl extended her hand, pointing again to the window. Emily looked and saw the man advancing, his steps deliberate and slow. He reached out as well, his presence suffocating. Emily turned back to the girl, tears welling in her eyes. "You need to be free," she whispered. A sudden crash echoed through the house as the man burst through the window, shattering the glass. He advanced toward Emily, his form wavering like smoke. The room seemed to close in, walls pulsating with an unseen force. Emily grabbed the girl's hand, but it felt cold, lifeless. "Run," the girl urged, her voice fading. Emily turned and fled down the hallway, the house groaning and shifting around her. The man pursued, his footsteps echoing ominously. She could hear the girl's faint voice guiding her, leading her toward the exit. Each step felt like a battle against the darkness that sought to consume her. Bursting through the front door, Emily didn't stop running until she reached her car. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. As she started the engine and pulled away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The house loomed behind her, silent once more. For a moment, she thought she saw the girl standing in the window, watching her leave. Driving home, Emily tried to process what had happened. The experience felt too real, too vivid to be a mere hallucination. She glanced at her camera, hoping to find some explanation in the photos. As she reviewed them later that night, her blood ran cold. Each image of the nursery showed the girl, her eyes empty and sorrowful, standing where Emily had stood. And in one photo, the man was visible, his face a void of darkness, reaching out from the shadows. Emily never returned to the Holloway house, but the memories haunted her. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would hear the faint lullaby playing on the wind, a reminder of the souls trapped within those decaying walls. And whenever she looked at her photographs, she could feel their presence, a silent plea for release. One evening, unable to sleep, Emily decided to visit her favorite spot by the old oak tree in her backyard. She set up her camera, hoping to capture something beautiful to distract herself from the nightmares. As she adjusted the lens, she felt a chill in the air, and the familiar lullaby began to play softly. She looked through the viewfinder and froze. There, standing beside the oak, was the little girl from the house, her eyes hollow and pleading. Behind her stood the man, his form dark and oppressive. Emily's heart pounded as the figures began to move toward her, their intentions clear. "Help us!" Emily turned to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. The presence enveloped her, the air thick with sorrow and fear. She felt a cold hand grip her shoulder, pulling her back. Desperately, she tried to break free, but the grip only tightened, the voices growing louder. "Help us rest!" In a final desperate effort, Emily screamed, jolting herself awake. She was drenched in sweat, her heart racing. The room was dark, silent except for her heavy breathing. She glanced at her camera on the table, but it was empty. No photos, no evidence of her visit. Relieved yet unsettled, Emily vowed to leave the past behind. She deleted the Holloway House photos, hoping to erase the memories that tormented her. But some things cannot be forgotten so easily. The whispers continued, growing louder each night, reminding her of the souls she couldn't save. One night, as the wind howled outside, Emily felt the familiar chill. She saw her reflection in the mirror, her eyes now hollow, mirroring the ghosts that haunted her. The girl stood beside her, and the man loomed behind. Their voices intertwined, a chorus of desperation. "Help us rest." Emily realized with a sinking heart that she had become part of their story. trapped in a cycle of fear and sorrow. The house had claimed her, just as it had so many before, and now her presence would join the whispers, another true scary story to keep others up at night. It was nearly midnight when Thomas checked into the Lakewood Motel, exhausted from hours of driving down empty highways. The motel was a rundown relic, barely visible from the road, its neon sign flickering with a dim glow. He hadn't meant to drive this long, but with most rest stops deserted, he had little choice. The clerk behind the counter was an elderly man, pale with hollow eyes, who handed Thomas a key without a word. "Room 13, the old man muttered, his voice rough as gravel. Thomas noticed the odd number, but was too tired to question it. He took the key in his bag, trudging down the hallway toward his room. The motel was silent, except for the occasional hum of the lights. As he reached room 13, he hesitated. The door looked worn, with scratches marring the wood around the handle. It felt colder here, and a strange scent hung in the air, something metallic, like rust. Ignoring the unease that prickled at his skin, Thomas unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with walls painted a sickly green and peeling wallpaper that seemed to curl toward him. A single small window overlooked the parking lot, where his car was the only one in sight. As he set his bag down, he noticed the faintest echo, like footsteps down the hall, though he hadn't seen anyone else. "Guess it's just an old building," he muttered to himself, trying to brush off the creeping feeling. He closed the curtains, kicked off his shoes, and collapsed onto the bed. As he settled, his eyes began to drift shut, exhaustion overpowering the lingering sense of dread. But then a faint tapping sound echoed through the silence. Thomas jolted awake, his eyes darting to the door. It sounded as though someone was gently tapping, a slow, deliberate rhythm. He held his breath, waiting for it to stop, but the sound continued. He checked the time, 12:32 a.m., and rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the irritation. "Must be the wind," he told himself, forcing a chuckle. Yet the sound continued, soft but insistent. Rising, he approached the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, bathed in the faint yellow glow of flickering lights. No one was there. He frowned, but when he opened the door, the hallway stretched silent and still. Shrugging, he closed the door and returned to the bed, more eager than ever for sleep. Just as he was drifting off, the tapping resumed, this time from the window. Thomas's heart pounded as he turned toward the window. He was on the second floor, and there were no trees or anything outside that could be making the noise. Summoning the courage, he walked over and peeked through a gap in the curtains. Outside, the night was still, the parking lot empty. But as he backed away, he caught a faint reflection in the glass, a shadowy figure standing just behind him. He spun around, but the room was empty. His skin prickled as he locked the door and double-checked the window. He returned to bed, pulling the covers tight around himself. Sleep felt impossible now, as every small sound in the room seemed amplified, the ticking of the clock almost unbearable. Then, just as he was about to give up on resting, he heard it. A voice, a low whisper, calling his name. Thomas. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but unmistakably real. His blood ran cold. It sounded like a woman, but no one else had been around when he checked in. The voice came again, closer this time, as if whispering just beside his ear. "Thomas?" He sat up, scanning the room in terror. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence answered him, but he could feel something, a presence, cold and heavy, lingering in the room. Slowly, he got out of bed, intending to grab his things and leave. But as he reached for his bag, a new sound stopped him. A scratching, coming from inside the closet. It was faint, like nails scraping against wood, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He stared at the closet, his heart pounding, but couldn't bring himself to move. Then the closet door creaked open, just an inch. The dim light revealed nothing but darkness inside, but the scratching grew louder, more frantic. Thomas backed away, stumbling toward the door, his gaze fixed on the closet. Suddenly, the door swung open completely, and a figure lurched out. A woman, her face twisted and gaunt, eyes hollow and lifeless. She staggered forward, her bony hand reaching toward him. "Why didn't you help me?" she whispered, her voice filled with anguish. Thomas couldn't breathe. He scrambled for the door, his fingers fumbling with the lock. Behind him, the woman advanced, her expression a mask of pain and fury. "Why didn't you help me?" she repeated, louder this time, her voice echoing through the room. The lock finally clicked, and he tore the door open, stumbling into the hallway. He ran, heart hammering, until he reached the front desk. The elderly clerk looked up, his expression blank. "There's someone in my room," Thomas gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "A woman. She was in the closet." The clerk's eyes were dull as he nodded. "Room 13, he murmured. "They say it's haunted, you know. Years ago, a young woman checked into that room, running from someone or something. She never checked out." Thomas's mouth went dry as the old man continued, his voice emotionless. "Her body was found days later, locked in the closet. No one could explain it. Now, they say she lingers, waiting for someone to help her escape, but no one ever does." Thomas backed away, his skin crawling. He didn't wait for another word. He turned, sprinting out of the lobby and into the night. He drove for hours, not daring to stop until the sun rose over the horizon. The memory of that night lingered, haunting his thoughts. He tried to convince himself it had been a nightmare, a trick of his tired mind. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, the hollow-eyed woman in room 13, still waiting, still whispering his name. And as he lay in bed, he heard it again, the soft, relentless tapping, as if she had followed him, waiting for him to answer her call. Daniel's hands trembled as he drove down the desolate stretch of road that led to his family's old farmhouse. He hadn't been back since his parents had died, leaving the property empty and, from what he'd heard, in a state of eerie disrepair. But his brother had insisted it was time to sell it, and that meant Daniel needed to go through the house one last time, clear out the remaining items, and assess its condition. He arrived at dusk, the farmhouse silhouetted against a sky streaked with bruised purple clouds. The place was just as he remembered it, a large, hulking structure with peeling paint, surrounded by thick trees. As he stepped out of the car, he could feel the air thicken with the weight of memories, each one tinged with a sense of unease. Inside, the smell of dust and mildew hit him like a wave. The house was deathly quiet, the kind of quiet that felt like it was listening. He tried to shake off the chill creeping up his spine as he made his way through the familiar rooms. It was strange, but the place seemed darker than it should have been, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the little light that filtered in through the grimy windows. As he moved through the living room, he heard a faint sound, a shuffling coming from upstairs. He froze, every instinct telling him to leave. But he convinced himself it was just the old house settling, creaking after years of neglect. He took a deep breath, told himself he was being ridiculous, and headed toward the stairs. Each step groaned under his weight, the sound echoing through the empty house. The shuffling noise grew louder as he approached the second floor, seeming to come from the direction of his parents' old bedroom. "Hello," he called, his voice shaky. The only answer was a silence, so thick it felt like it pressed down on him. Heart pounding, he pushed open the door to the bedroom. The room was empty, just a few pieces of old furniture shrouded in white sheets. But as he scanned the space, his eyes landed on something that made his blood run cold, a faint outline of footprints in the dust, leading from the door to the far corner of the room. Daniel stared at the footprints, feeling a prickle of fear rise up the back of his neck. They looked fresh. Swallowing hard, he turned to leave, but a low whisper stopped him in his tracks. "Daniel." It was barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakable. He whipped around, searching the empty room, but there was no one there. His pulse raced as he tried to convince himself that he was just hearing things. "Daniel." The whisper came again, this time from the hallway. He backed out of the room, peering down the dim corridor, but it was empty. Just shadows clinging to the walls, twisting and warping in the fading light. Suddenly, the door at the end of the hall, the door to his old childhood bedroom, creaked open, revealing a sliver of darkness within. He felt a wave of dread wash over him, but something compelled him to walk toward it, as though he were being pulled forward by an invisible thread. The room was just as he remembered it, though everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. But something was wrong. The air felt colder here, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. As he stood there, he noticed something strange about the wall across from his bed. It looked wrong, somehow, almost as though the shadows were shifting, forming shapes that didn't make sense. Then he saw it, a figure emerging from the darkness, barely distinguishable from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long, fingers that ended in sharpened points. Its eyes were hollow, but they watched him, filled with an intelligence and hunger that froze him to the core. "Why did you come back?" the figure whispered, its voice scratching against his mind like nails on glass. "This place doesn't want you." Daniel couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring his terror. "Do you remember me, Daniel?" It hissed, its face stretching into a grotesque approximation of a smile. "Do you remember what you saw?" His heart thundered as flashes of a long-buried memory surfaced. Nights spent lying in bed, wide-eyed with terror, as he watched shadows dance across his walls. He'd always thought it was just his imagination, childish fears playing tricks on him. But now, staring into the hollow eyes of the figure before him, he knew it had been real. Without thinking, he stumbled backward, trying to escape. But the figure moved faster, sliding across the room in one fluid motion until it was inches from his face. The smell of decay filled his nostrils, and he fought the urge to gag. "You can't leave," it whispered, each word dripping with malice. "You belong to this place, just like me." With a strength he didn't know he possessed, Daniel broke free of its gaze and bolted from the room. He sprinted down the stairs, his heart pounding as he heard footsteps following him, relentless and inhuman. He didn't look back, didn't dare. Bursting out the front door, he ran to his car, fumbling for his keys with shaking hands. He could feel it behind him, feel its presence pressing against him, but he didn't stop. Finally, he managed to start the car, slamming down on the gas as he sped away from the farmhouse. As he drove, he glanced in the rearview mirror, his breath catching in his throat. Standing in the doorway of the farmhouse was the figure, watching him with those hollow eyes, its face twisted into that unnatural smile. It watched him until he was out of sight. Daniel never went back to the farmhouse. His brother handled the sale, and Daniel refused to discuss what he'd seen. But sometimes, late at night, he'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye. A tall, shadowy figure with hollow eyes, watching, waiting. And he knew, deep down, that it had followed him.